So let's talk about critical thinking. I love that cartoon. Don't you love that cartoon? That's what they think is going to happen, though, right? They think that they're going to come in and you're going to tell them. And then you're going to, no, you're not just going to tell them. You're going to do some telling, but you're going to ask them to think about it. So critical thinking is a sort of contested idea. You have, and maybe you have a deep commitment about how you think about it. And I know at least in these areas, critical thinking has some pretty distinctive definition in these different fields. And so, yes, bring that to your students with the caveat, perhaps, that in my field, here's how critical thinking often shows up. In other places in the university, you're going to learn about it in different kinds of ways. So they're going to take philosophy class, they're going to take a logic class, perhaps, where critical thinking is spelled out in some very particular ways based on how philosophers approach argument and syllogisms and premises and all of that kind of stuff. What I think is important for us at this level is to help them appreciate this idea going forward as something that has broad application. Critical thinking is about clarifying and understanding the truth, and as a result, living the truth in confident ways. It's grounded back to what Eileen is so passionate about, and I love her passion on this, in curiosity. Critical thinking begins with wanting to know something and leads to wanting to get real clear on the truth about that something. And critical thinking involves a willingness to consider a perspective different from the one that I currently have. So those are some connections to some of the things that, again, undergird our course together. Okay, so I'd like you to talk to each other a little bit. I ask you to spend a few minutes looking at the Foundation for Critical Thinking website. Talk to each other a little bit about what you found there that interested you and maybe could be useful in your seminar. Now, some of you haven't had a chance to do this. I'd like you to be inspired by others about the many resources on this website that you might find useful, so chat about that. And I wonder if you might have had a chance to scan. So this is one of those principles, right? If I don't think everybody's going to have a chance to read it all, I'll hope that at least some people scan to be able to have something to say. One of these articles that I put in your packet, what might you have gleaned that would be helpful there? So let me give you about 8 minutes to talk about those two resources as they were useful to you and perhaps in your conversation might become useful to others, okay? Chat around your table about that. So what is something that you heard at your table and in conversation with others that you said to yourself, at some range, you said to yourself, well, I hadn't thought of it that way before. Somebody gave an idea, something they read, a practical example. I hadn't thought of it that way before. Something somebody else said that you heard.
What?
Sorry, we were chatting.
What is something somebody else said at the table today that you thought as they said it, I hadn't thought of it that way before? It's a different...
The test at the beginning of the term and the end of the term, because this has assessment in it as well.
Okay, in terms of critical thinking.
Yeah.
So you hadn't thought of it that way before in terms of a way to think about that throughout the course. In this first-year seminar, freshman students, I hope that after every class you will walk out saying, I hadn't thought of it that way before. I hope that you'll find your ability to discern new insights from other people and to even recognize in yourself some kinds of thinking that may be at odds with what you're discovering to be true will lead you to say, I hadn't thought of it that way before. So what I think you want to, now back to you as the educators, what you want to do is create moments where students quirk their head a little bit because they heard something, they read something, you said something, and they hadn't thought of it that way before. That's a part of our work. If you decide you want to read one book on this topic, I would recommend Brookfield's book, Teaching for Critical Thinking. Brookfield, as you may know by now, is a leading person in adult education, so you might think about the adaptation to a younger crowd, and yet he's thought a lot about this. He's got 3 books on critical thinking and tells the story early in this book of how critical thinking saved his life and presents a pretty compelling case for the value of this idea. At the beginning, he unpacks these 4 ideas. I'm not doing a math in first-year seminar class. That he would say are the things that critical thinking is, how it is held in common across disciplines. So we go back to the circle or the frame where all the different disciplines have ways of approaching it. Brookfield would say they all do this, some kind of this. It's about uncovering assumptions within, and for Brookfield, he's interested in us uncovering our own assumptions and getting them on the table and paying attention to those. And as well the assumptions in what we read or what we hear from others. Engaging then in an analysis of those assumptions. Part of how we do that analysis is by bringing alternative perspectives in, perspective taking, and seeing this idea through the lens of another. And then what does it lead me to do? What action does it lead me to do as a response to now being clearer about the truth, about how the world works? What am I going to do about it? So this is, I think, valuable. Let's not forget again, this is a recurring theme. Who are we teaching? So here's an article, kind of like what Marjorie was mentioning earlier, related to faith development. Here's one on cognitive development in adolescence. And so when you get this, you'll have these excerpts. I do this sometimes in class. I've got 2 slides you see. Turn it into this. This can be something they put at their table. I may later ask them to read the whole article, but for class discussion, I might put just a part of it up there. I'm not asking people to like too many words on the slide, but it's a way to demonstrate scholarly literature and to put it front and center and to invite them to consider it. I just want to point one thing out to you here as we think about these folks we're teaching. For example, up in this column, although individuals thinking about moral dilemmas becomes more principled over the course of adolescence, their reasoning about real-life problems is often not as advanced as their reasoning about hypothetical dilemmas. Let that sink in. I think there's something powerful for us to keep in mind here. The correlation between adolescent moral reasoning and their moral behavior is especially likely to break down when individuals define issues as personal choices rather than ethical dilemmas. For instance, when drugs is seen as a personal matter rather than a moral issue. Similarly, when faced with a logical argument, adolescents are more likely to accept faulty reasoning or shaky evidence when they agree with the substance of the argument than when they do not. And although an individual's ability to look at things from another person's perspective increases in adolescence, the extent to which this advanced social perspective taking translates into tolerance for others' viewpoints depends on the particular issue involved. In other words, adolescents' social reasoning, like that of adults, is influenced not only by their basic intellectual abilities, but by their desires, motives, and interests. So you're going to be more likely to capture their interest in this if you keep in mind 2 things. Does this connect with something that they have interest in and are willing to think deeply about as a starting point to getting them more developed in this way? And is it not so personal that it forces them in the middle of their peers? That's another thing that comes out in this article. They're still, as you know, very peer sensitive, and they're going to be hesitant to say something that's going to make them look bad with their peers, even though they might be able to do it here. So if you put a case study or a historic story or a question about somebody else or other people out there, we can help them make the personal connections, but rather than start with the personal connections in terms of things like critical thinking and even deeper understanding of faith, we start with something that allows it to be more objective. I think that's a really helpful insight about this particular group of folks as we think about helping them learn to think. Erin.
I just have a question about, and I don't know if others have seen this, but I feel like because we now teach in a post-post modern world,
Post.
which is awesome. Let's just keep adding post, right?
You art people are so creepy. Yeah.
We're post-racial, we're post-gender, we've got it all out. We're post-Christian, so
Right,
that's why we're here. But, good Lord. But,
Were you being Joe Isuzu just now? You were lying, right? Okay.
But just to say, I'm so interested in what you're saying about, when people make something a personal matter rather than a moral issue, they kind of turn it off more. And I feel like what I find over and over again is that everything's a personal issue because we live in this postmodern time of, well, that's true for you, professor, and that's great. So the critical piece of the thinking kind of breaks down because it's like, well, you know, I don't want to use drugs. It's kind of like my dad became a radical Christian at 22, and he was so lost before that he was totally unclear on what to do, so he gave his bong to his friend. And he said, well, I can't use it anymore, but you should.
Right.
Bong, you know? Sometimes I feel like that with our students, where it's just like, well, that's not good for me, but maybe it's good for them. And so the thinking kind of breaks down, because it's sort of like, what is moral? What is ethical? Isn't it all kind of personal? Sorry, if you could speak to that.
Okay, yeah. So I think in order to appreciate what's happening developmentally and to be able to give them tools to be able to work with, I'm going to suggest, based on some of the things I've experienced, let's start with a case or an objectified discussion of this. And because I like getting students talking to each other, and social concerns are a concern to them, I'm sensitive to the fact that they might not, assert their convictions because they want to impress so-and-so over here. But then as a result of that conversation, and they've read some things and such, then I might say, I'd like you to write me a 2-page essay in which you tell me, now, as a result of all this, where do you stand? Now they can be personal about making the connections. How do you feel? Take all of these things and apply them to the last movie you saw, right? So if I'm going to connect it to my class in some way, you talked about it in general and how people might do this. Now, how about you? And then it can be a private thing, and they might be more likely to assert some of the convictions that have developed out of this conversation. So I think we can do both, but we're sensitive to what's happening in them as we.
I guess I'm just trying to figure out how to teach morality in a time where things don't seem to
You're right, yeah.
objective, because the key word that you just used is objective.
Yeah.
And I think it's really hard.
Right, no, and the postmodern mind doesn't, nothing is, right? And there's no such thing. So sometimes when I'm feeling courageous, I will say to my students, hi, welcome to the first day of class. I'm here because I know more than you do. I've studied these things. I have a PhD. I'm 50 years old, not quite 51, 50 years old. I have a lot of life experience, and the university recognizes my expertise. But you know what? You know more than I do, because you've lived a life too, and you've read things, and you know things. And if we do this right, and I trust you, which I do, and if you come to trust me, which I hope you do, this is going to be amazing, what we're going to discover together in relationship, right? And I intend to learn from you, but I want you to intend and commit to learn from me and from each other as we go forward. Can we do that? Let's go. Then sort of we put some of that on the table in terms of authority, because I position myself in the place that I've been assigned, but I also recognize relationally and pedagogically learning from each other is something important. Okay, 15 minutes. So what can we do in terms of critical thinking in light of the people, the time, and your class is not on critical thinking. Maybe some of your classes that is going to be a major focus, but many of our classes here, that's not what your class is about. So what can we do? 2 suggestions for you. 1, model critical thinking personally, and 2, move them from stage 1 to stage 3. Let's talk about modeling, okay? Think in preparation for your class, and perhaps in preparation for each week of class, if you're going to model this over and over again. What is a foundational core assumption on which your course is based? So you come with some convictions about what you want them to understand at the end. So spell that out. Is there someone who has articulated this well, so that you identify that you're a person who's not standing independently and anecdotally on your own experience and expertise and modeling the opposite that you're describing, Brian, but other people have helped me to see this, and here's who they are. Is there someone who has articulated a rebuttal to your assumption, and how have you come to conclude that the assumption you come into class with is true? Maybe you adjusted in your journey in that regard. In the introduction of a new topic, this might be the kind of thing that you do that allows you to demonstrate. Further, are there ideas, assertions, proposals, standards of practice that you were once curious about that you're probably still curious about? So let's connect curiosity. Let me tell you something that I got curious about 10 or 15 years ago when I was first investigating this subject. And we're going to talk about it today, but let me tell you about my journey in curiosity. Here's what made me curious. How about wanting to know more about that issue? What processes have you gone through that has given you confidence about these ideas? Can you articulate a clear argument for why you find these ideas to be true and worthy to be believed? Did the process create any intellectual uncertainty and doubt? And that's okay, and they should hear about that. When I read so-and-so, I stopped in my tracks and I said, now that one I'm going to have to struggle with a little bit, because that's different than what I came through the door today thinking. How did you go about dealing with that? So in the modeling kind of thing, you might turn this into a class presentation, informal or formal, that helps them see how you've gone through this process. Okay, can you hand out those please? So this article is in the collection that I gave you in the iPad on the stages of critical thinking from Linda Elder. Who wrote this one? Yeah, both of them, Linda Elder and Richard Paul. And I hope that you'll read this. And I think this gives us some possibilities in terms of realistic options for what we can do in a first-year seminar class. On the first page, which you don't have, I have it in my hands, they say, we make the following assumptions. 1, there are predictable stages through which every person who develops as a critical thinker passes. So even this article on critical thinking, you could do an assessment of, do you agree with that assumption? Do you think that's true? Number 2, that passage from one stage to the next is dependent upon a necessary level of commitment on the part of an individual to develop as a critical thinker. It's not automatic, and it's likely to take place subconsciously. So what we want to do is help them become conscious in their decision to become thoughtful people during their time in your class and at APU. The assumption that success in instruction is deeply connected to the intellectual quality of student learning. So your success in what you do and what you want them to get and their success in learning are mutually dependent on each other and need to work in tandem, and that regression is possible in development. So we can go backwards in this, you and I and they. So this would be an argument, I think, an implicit argument for doing this sort of consistently in your class, demonstrating it and giving opportunities for students to do it. I would like you at your tables to look at the handout describing critical thinking stages 1 through 3. Read the description, and maybe you'd split this in half, like half the people do this part. Read the description of the unreflective thinker, and then the next part is looking at the description of the challenged thinker, and then the description of the beginning thinker. And what I'm suggesting you do is, let's adjust this a little bit in terms of time, think about what you can do in your class to help people move a little bit, okay? I'm suggesting 1 through 3. You might say, I'd be happy to get them at the trailing end of 1, or maybe 2, okay? So, and that, I think, practically speaking, will lead you to adjust some of the ways you think about critical thinking activities and assessment in a first-year seminar class. So kind of divide up that reading between those 3 stages and then talk to each other about what you think that might look like in a first-year seminar class with these students, okay? Willing, going forward. How about talking about ways that critical thinking will aid them in their college and beyond? So it's going to help in problem solving and in creativity and in decision making and in strategic thinking and organizational planning and openness, so that they hear this kind of language from you over time will help them appreciate and I think move from stage 1 to stage 2, maybe moving towards stage 3. Teach definitions and means for developing one or more intellectual virtues. Again, you might take one of those and talk about a person who's an exemplar in the theme of your class and how they practice intellectual virtue, or how you practice intellectual virtue in studying a difficult topic and what you did to develop that. Find one or more ways to provide evaluation and feedback of students attempting critical thinking using critical thinking skills and intellectual virtues. So Lori had us do that 1-page paper or 1-minute paper the first day. You might say, all right, we've been talking about critical thinking around the subject. Here's a question. I want you to, for 1 minute, attempt some of these reasoning skills. And maybe it could be a pass, no pass thing, but those 8 sentences that you write or speak to them could be helpful. And use the research paper as a graded place to do that, okay? So I gave you this critical thinking PowerPoint as a way to introduce it. Does anybody have any questions about that or things you would suggest in altering or amending it in ways that could be helpful? So that's a resource if it's useful to you. That's why I shared that with you. Okay.
No, it's not. You had to go to the, oh, you're talking about the website, never mind.
Is this PowerPoint in the?
Yeah, it's
25 seconds. Quick.
What good timing.
Yeah, perhaps, yeah. Okay. I'm going to give you, wow. The game? Okay. I'm going to give you, in the PowerPoint, a generic strategy. I was going to have you kind of make something up around an artificial course at your tables, but you can do that in a real course in your work. So any final thoughts that you have from your experience in critical thinking that you think would be broadly useful to all of us as we think about first-year students and this topic? Jeff?
Perhaps so, yeah. Leadership development? I mean, the development of a leader?
Yeah. And you know, you have different stages.
Sure.
Different stages of leaders.
Yeah.
I just didn't know if people at higher leadership stages may have higher stages where they find help with everything.
Yeah. I would like to experientially think so, but I don't have the informed reflection to work with on that one.
I think Brookfield would also say that because critical thinking can be intimidating to a number of students, including first-generation students, just the idea of that also discussing in a parallel way the emotional rhythms of learning and how we all experience that 3 steps. We're not the only, you're not the only person in the room that this might be intimidating.
Okay, good. That's excellent, right?
And I think
Insensitive to that whole person thing, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the kind of thing that could feed into that final paper, right? You're thinking about developing intellectually here, but we also recognize that your emotional development will feed into how you're going to attend to that. Write about that in that moment.
Because I teach law classes, and the court reasons through things, and you never quite have a perfect answer because they could look at the situation this way, and they could look at it this way. I've used Jenga blocks, and I've put students in teams, and they are going to be looking at this particular situation and figure out how many arguments they can make for this position. And then they have to build pillars with their Jenga blocks and then, hold them. So at the end, we see whose Jenga house is strongest and how the court might rule.
Yeah.
And that's, kind of a fun way to
Good.
engage in.
Good tactile things that
Yeah,
makes
they have something to do.
the abstract
There's a little
stuff.
competition.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. Good. Yeah.
I was just going to say, what I heard Stephanie saying, that one of the things we talked about as a group is just kind of showing humility too as a professor and making it sort of this understanding that there's places where I might still be at stage 1 or 2 thinking of math per se, right? Just calling myself out, where I just kind of think, oh, that's not really for me. I'm not really good at that, and I'm just going to keep playing to my strengths and think about the things that I'm really good at thinking about. And this it is a challenge, going back to what they were saying day 1. We're all kind of taught to think if we have to think too hard about something or try too hard at something, we're not smart. And just embracing that even as professors, we have to really push ourselves.
Good. Yeah.
And I think it really ties in, I just want to connect with the diversity and like what issues are most emotion laden. Because I'm thinking like vaccinations. I mean, where you can do a real critical thinking kind of piece around it, but it's so controversial and so personal. And then just doing that self-reflection and the cultural pieces too.
I'm just picking up on what you said. I do think it's crucial to good critical thinking to emphasize that having emotions about a topic is not the same thing as being irrational about a topic.
Good. Yeah, passion about something doesn't mean I haven't thought it through or should or could.
Right, that self-awareness building. Right?
In Brookfield's book, he gives you some more ideas. So I gave you a few ideas to look at in the introductory materials. If you haven't watched that Clint Eastwood chair, go to YouTube and type in Republican National Convention. It's just humorous to watch, right? Wherever your convictions are, it doesn't matter. He has this conversation with Obama, right? It's clever the way he does it and gets a laugh from people. But I think it's also illustrative of what we can do in modeling for students how the real world works. Here's my convictions on this. I'm passionate about it. Here's my arguments. Well, come on now. Let me reply to that with some of the things. You probably haven't thought about that. Well, you're right. I hadn't thought about that. A little back and forth thing helps to demonstrate that. And so he's got a lot of creative ideas. Brookfield has made his website available that provides a lot of the descriptions of these things as he uses them in classes. And so you have lots of resources with the Critical Thinking Foundation, Brookfield, and other places to get some good things, okay? Thank you so much for your time today. I got to be with you a lot this morning, and I'm grateful for you, and look forward to you having my son Elijah in your class.